If you've been following the teachings of Eckhart Tolle for a long time but struggled to put those teachings into practice, this video is for you. Here's what nobody tells you about being a long-term spiritual practitioner. Sometimes it gets harder before it gets easier. I mean that the more mindful you become, the more you grow in awareness, the more you can see. And guess what that includes, at least in my experience? It means seeing your own ego, your own fear. It means being acutely aware of the compulsive, self-deprecating voice in your head. It means being fine-tuned to the emotional patterns of your partner or your children and seeing their self-sabotage before they do. And even though you can see it, there is quite often nothing you can do about it. If you're not careful, all that awareness can leave you absolutely drowning in gaps. The gap between what you know and what you can actually do. The gap between the theoretical ideal that you're always aware of, that you can see, and that sometimes you can glimpse inside yourself, and the reality of your own limitations. And that gap sometimes becomes its own source of suffering. At least it does for me, if I'm not careful. My name's Becky Moller. I've been a mindfulness and meditation teacher for the past 10 years, and I run retreats and a year-long program called Undone Academy. That is a framework for living the teachings of Eckhart Tolle and others in that same spiritual space. I was sitting in retreat with Eckhart in Whistler, British Columbia last month. I was there with my husband and my oldest son, which was beautiful and meaningful in itself. And I just so happened to have had a major trauma trigger the week earlier, the biggest embodied triggered response I'd had in years. So as I sat listening to Eckhart, who's been a mentor to me for over a decade now, I felt deeply seen, but not in the inspired spiritual teacher way I sometimes do when I sit with his teachings, in a painful, deeply humbling way. Because he was describing something I did not want to fully admit to myself. He was describing the mechanism of an unconscious pain body. And I saw myself in it so clearly. I felt broken, just like I did 10 years ago before I found Eckhart. I was sitting again in the powerlessness of my own relentless mind, a decade past what I would call my own awakening season. Here I was, lost again in suffering and mental patterns of self-loathing, despite having been on this path for over a decade and teaching these principles on a daily basis. I've written a book about healing and wholeness, and here I was in a room with Eckhart Tolle, realizing that what he calls pain body and what I often refer to as trauma is still strong enough in me to knock me off my feet. At least it was that day. That was a hard pill to swallow, but it was exactly what I needed to see. What Eckhart said, and I wrote it down because I needed to hear it, was this: your goal, your work, is to bring together the two dimensions of your life, the doing and the being, to be able to exist in both with skill and balance without losing either dimension. That was an idea and a theme he came back to over and over again over that weekend in Whistler. And the words sat in me and resonated. Because this is how spiritual awakening has looked for me, and how I've seen it look for many of the people that I've held in my own program. When rock bottom hits, it shocks us into being. This being vertical dimension that Eckhart talks about, into presence, into feeling the deep side of life. In that rock bottom, I buried the doing part of me, the horizontal dimension that Eckhart talks about. I spent 3 or 4 years figuring out how to just be, and that sacred, precious being space, that vertical dimension, the present moment space, is where it felt like I found myself, in giving up my attachments to the world of achievement or identity, in being safely surrendered and not caring about anything other than feeling that peace of being inside of me. It felt so good, I never wanted to lose it. But as life wore on, I found myself continually presented by life, by the universe, with the invitation to step back into the doing dimension. Something wanted to be created through me, and I could feel it. And I couldn't not do it. And I cautiously picked up that doing part of myself again. I led a 12-step recovery foundation as an executive director. I became a certified mindfulness and meditation teacher and started my own business. I wrote and published my book, Undone, Unafraid. But through all of these manifestations, there's this battle I often get caught in inside myself as I'm trying so hard to live a life that is aligned and intentional. And I think sometimes that I unconsciously adopt the belief, without meaning to, that the goal is always to be rather than do. That presence was the destination and productivity was the detour, even the enemy. But last month in Whistler, that is not what I heard Eckhart saying. What he was saying is that for those of us who have been on this path for a while, or for any spiritual seeker who is trying to live a life of surrender, the challenge is not to just retreat into pure being and disappear into the vertical dimension of life. The challenge is to hold both, being and doing, simultaneously, with skill and balance and presence. That is actually harder. And over the last 10 years, I'd have to say it's much harder than I even still give it credit for. The longer I'm on the path, maybe the harder it is to maintain the balance. I write about this balance in my memoir, Undone, Unafraid. There was this period in my life, that rock bottom space, when this piece inside, this being dimension, was fragile and new. When I was driving to teach fitness classes at the university every afternoon, sometimes with tears still on my face. At that time, I knew very little conceptually about the spiritual awakening that was unfolding inside me. I didn't even have words to explain what I felt or what it was. I would pray in the parking lot every day before walking into my university classes. God, please give me the strength to do this. I don't know if I can, but I know you can. And then I would walk in to the gym at Brigham Young University and teach Zumba or high intensity intervals for 2 hours. And each stomp and swoop of the music became an expression of grief I could not even name. Became my trauma, my pain body moving through me and willingly being released. That was doing, anchored in something deeper. That was the doing dimension flowing from the being dimension. And I was doing it without even knowing it. I didn't understand it at the time. I just knew that something larger than me was moving through me. And it changed me in ways I'm still discovering, in ways I still wish I could recreate at that rock bottom, pin drop stillness. For me, that's what it's looked like when the two dimensions are held together, organically, imperfectly, and often in the middle of your own undoing. It's not a glamorous picture, but it is real in a way that you can feel down to your bones. And sometimes the less you know, the easier it is to find it. When I'm honest with myself, I can feel exactly where the split happens. I can feel when my doing is anchored in presence, when I'm teaching, when I'm in a one-to-one mentoring session with someone, when I'm leading a retreat. There's a flow, an ease. There's no grasping in it. The doing just flows. But there's also a kind of doing I slip into that loses its being. A doing that is driven by output and strategy, that has a lot of thinking involved in it. And underneath, there's something in there that's trying to prove something, or afraid of my own imperfections, afraid of disappointing others, afraid of losing love. And in that mode, that old friend, ego, starts to slip back in. And eventually, the pain body shows up. And then I am confused and hurting and wondering, how did I get here? Here is what this retreat with Eckhart Tolle helped me remember. This resurgence of pain body is not evidence that I am failing. It is evidence that I have lost the present moment and that I am engaged in a lifelong practice. And that big picture speaking, I am very much a beginner in something that is still new. Because doing and being at the same time with skill, without losing either, that is the practice of a lifetime. Not the warm-up, that is it. I see myself as a kind of toddler. Learning to balance these two dimensions is like learning to walk. You fall, you correct, you overcorrect, you fall again. That doesn't mean you're bad at walking or you shouldn't walk. It means you're learning how to do something you've never done before, that nobody else can really explain to you, that you have to feel out for yourself in your body to know what feels right. And that is not a problem. That is not a failure. That is just where I am. There is room for this too. This, in fact, is exactly what we're all doing here. Every one of us, whether we know it cognitively, consciously, or not. And it's what we'll be doing, learning this balancing act until we're safely dead. So, if you are somewhere on this path, if you have been practicing presence, studying these teachings from Eckhart Tolle or Michael Singer or Richard Rohr or Sarah Blondin, and you still find yourself getting pulled into doing, pulled into ego identity, losing yourself in productivity, waking up one day feeling like you forgot who you are again, I want you to know that it is not a spiritual failure. I believe this is the actual work we are here to do. And it's exactly why I created my framework of Undone Academy, a weekly live Zoom meeting that adds a principle or gives a point of focus to hold a lifetime of spiritual awakening in a container that can provide consistent practice, progress, and feedback, not just from me, but from all of the fellow humans and fellow seekers in the space. The question I'm sitting with, and then I want to leave with you, where in your life do you feel the split between doing and being the most? Not as a problem to fix right now, just as an observation. And can you identify in the mental thought pattern, what is the narrative that keeps getting you hooked out of that space of being able to be present and allow whatever's here and into that space, that old egoic space of self-judgment and fear? Because you cannot work with what you cannot see. That is where the practice begins. Not in the knowing cognitively, in the seeing, in the allowing, in the diverting the attention away from the pain and back to the stillness. Because in each and every moment, it is there. I'm Becky Moller. If this resonated and you realize you could use a structure and path to hold your journey of awakening, check out my year-long framework, Undone Academy. I'll include that link below. And come back for the next video in this series about my takeaways from the Eckhart Tolle retreat in Whistler, Canada. We're going to talk about something that may be at the root of why so many long-term practitioners still cannot access the peace that Eckhart teaches. And it has everything to do with knowing too much.